Okay, we're going to talk about something this morning that I hope it interests you. I hope it uplifts you. I hope it encourages you. But before we get started, I want to tell you something. In August of 2010, China was crowned the unofficial home of the mother of all traffic jams. And you're thinking, well, what in the world are you talking about? This traffic jam stretched for more than 62 miles, and it lasted for 12 days. Now, you think traffic around here is bad. The traffic jam was caused by some trucks carrying some coal to Beijing. And unofficial sources claim that each vehicle moved at an insane pace of 2 miles per day. And instead of hustling down the highway like they usually are, the cars were crawling at a snail's pace. And in some places, the vehicles weren't even moving at all. And some drivers even give up. They give up and they were playing cards with other drivers along the side of the road. And a few of them just got out of their cars and would take a nap on the pavement. Now that is a traffic jam. That is a traffic jam. But likewise, some Christians have stalled out and have either become spiritually sleepy or they're just taken to just playing games. So the question this morning, are you spiritually stuck today? Are you spiritually at a standstill? Do you wonder where your passion and your zeal, your excitement has gone? Some things seem to get bigger and bigger, don't they? Our spiritual problems get bigger. Our spiritual dryness gets bigger. Our struggles, our battles that we have to deal with, they get bigger. Now, all y'all know that I was born in Texas. You can tell by the way I talk where I'm from that I spent most of my life in the Lone Star State. And the Texas people are proud people. Now, that's just the way they are. They're just proud folks. And this Texas farmer, he went to Australia on vacation. I'd like to go to Australia on vacation. But this Texas farmer, he went to Australia on vacation, and he met this Aussie farmer who showed off his big wheat field. The Texans said, "Oh, we have wheat fields at least twice as big as that." Then they walked around the ranch for a little bit, and the Aussie showed off his herd of cattle. And the Texans said, "Oh, we have longhorns back home that are twice as large as your little old steers." Well, the conversation finally came to a standstill when the Texans saw a group of kangaroos hopping through the field. And he asked us, "What in the tarnation are those?" Well, the Aussie, he instantly knew. He instantly knew he had something on the Texan. So with a disbelieved look, he looked at the Texan and he said, "Don't y'all have grasshoppers in Texas?" Problems get bigger and bigger. Our spiritual problems get bigger. But Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews tells us in chapter 12, verse 3, he was expressing his concern about the early Christians. And he told them that he says, then you won't become weary and give up. We don't need to become weary and give up on things. So our topic today is crucial. It's critical because it's about our zeal for the Lord. Recognizing when our zeal is drying up and knowing how to rejuvenate it. Now, rejuvenate, that's a strange word, isn't it? It's kind of a different word. It means to revive. It means to renew, regenerate, restore. It means to breathe a new life into. A.W. Tozer once said, he said, the world, quit it. He didn't say that, but he said the world is perishing for the lack of the knowledge of God. And the church is famishing for want of his presence. Famishing. That means the church is very hungry. The church is starving to death for the want of his presence. Perhaps you've been feeling a little bit like that lately. Like your zeal is starting to dry up. Or you're longing for God's presence. We're going to look at 1 Kings chapter 19 in a minute. And what we're going to read may be a little lengthy. But in Nehemiah 8, it says that they read the book of Moses. They read the book of Moses to the people early in the morning and until noon. And they read it out loud to everyone who could understand. And they sat and they listened to it. Now, if you look at what they called the book of Moses, that was the laws. All, 5 of those books? And I believe if those people could have sat and listened to them read half a day, I believe that we can handle 15 verses, don't you? I don't think y'all's going to fall asleep on me yet. So, but in this passage is where Elijah. It's where Elijah, after his big spiritual victory, he became afraid. And he runs for his life. And he's exhausted, and he's depressed, and he's ready to give up. He's ready to throw in the towel. But God meets him in his place, rejuvenates him, feeds him, and sends him on to continue his work. So let's look at this story. Let's start out in verse 1. It says, when Ahab got home, he told Jezebel everything Elijah had done, including the way he had killed all the prophets of Baal. So Jezebel sent a message to Elijah. She said, may the gods strike me and even kill me if by this time tomorrow I have not killed you just as you killed them. Well, if you remember, Jezebel actually got thrown out of a window, hit the ground, and was eaten by some dogs. Verse 3, Elijah was afraid and fled for his life. He went to Beersheba, a town in Judea, and he left his servant there. Verse 4 says, then he went on alone into the wilderness, traveling all day. He sat down under a solitary broom tree and prayed that he might die. I have had enough. Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors who have already died. Then he laid down and slept under the broom tree. But as he was sleeping, an angel touched him and told him, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there beside his head was some bread baked on a hot stone and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and laid down again. Then the angel of the Lord came again and touched him and said, "Get up and eat some more, or the journey ahead will be too much for you." So he got up and he ate and he drank, and the food gave him enough strength to travel 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Sinai, the mountain of God. There he came to a cave where he spent the night, and the Lord said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah replied, he said, "I've zealously served the Lord God Almighty, but the people of Israel have broken their covenant with you, torn down your altars, and killed every one of your prophets. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me. Go out and stand before me on the mountain," the Lord told him. And as Elijah stood there, the Lord passed by. A mighty windstorm hit the mountain. It was such a terrible blast that the rocks were torn loose, but the Lord was not in the wind. As the wind there was, after the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. After the fire, there was a sound of a gentle whisper. Verse 13 says, when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And a voice said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah replied, basically the same thing here. "I have zealously served the Lord God Almighty. The people of Israel have broken their covenant with you, torn down your altars, and killed every one of your prophets. I am the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me." Then the Lord told him in verse 15, "Go back the same way you came and travel to the wilderness of Damascus." And then he skips down to verse 18. After he anointed everyone, he skipped down to verse 18 and he said, "Yet will I preserve 7,000 others in Israel who have never bowed down to Baal or kissed him." Now, I know that's a lot of scripture. That's a lot of verses to grasp. A lot of different things could come out of that. But as we look at this passage this morning, let's ask God to speak to us, to feed us, to rejuvenate our zeal, to give us a fresh mission. You know what zeal is? It's energy. It's enthusiasm. Recognizing our drying zeal is the first step to rejuvenating our passion. But it's not always easy. It's not always easy to admit that we've lost our zeal, especially if we're in a community of believers who seem to be doing things better for God than what we're doing. But it's crucial to be honest with ourselves and with God about where we're at. The Bible is full of examples of people who experience spiritual dryness. Even King David, the man after God's own heart, cried out in Psalms 42:1, "As the deer longs for streams of water, so I long for you, O God." David was experiencing a deep thirst for God. He was experiencing a longing that wasn't being satisfied. He was dry. He was parched for what God had, what things of God. So what kind of spiritual battle, what kind of spiritual fight have you been putting up with here lately? Have you become weak? Have you become passive? Meaning, well, whatsoever, que sera, sera. Have you been discouraged? Weary? Wounded? Elijah became discouraged. He became dry. He became wearied. And God restored his fight. Elijah had some great feats. He had some great accomplishments, didn't he? He stopped the rain for 3.5 years. He was supernaturally provided food during a famine. He called down fire from heaven on a sacrifice. He killed 450 prophets of Baal. Then he prayed again, and it rained. So he had some pretty significant accomplishments. But he had still lost his zeal. He'd lost his enthusiasm, his energy. He needed to be rejuvenated. He needed to be revived, renewed, restored. He needed a breath of life blown into him. Because Elijah had been under a lot of stress for 3 years. He'd been running as a fugitive, living on small quantities of food and clothing and shelter. But when he performed this miracle, he probably believed that if the nation saw a great miracle, if they saw something from God like fire coming out of heaven and fire licking up the water around the sacrifice, licking up the dust on the ground, and he figures if they seen a miracle like that they would give up their idolatry, turn to God, and experience a revival. But that didn't happen. That didn't happen because Ahab and Jezebel, they throwed a wrinkle in his get-along there. They didn't happen the way he expected it to happen. His efforts seemed useless. Jezebel immediately sent Elijah death threats and vows that instead of Baal worship being defeated, she was going to make it more popular. He felt like the only person still serving the Lord was him. Look at verse 14 again. It says, then the Israelites, the people of Israel, they've killed every one of your prophets. And I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me. In our modern world that we live in, there are many things that can cause us our zeal for God to dry up in there. We can become distracted. We can become distracted by our busyness of life, by our jobs, our families, our hobbies. We can become discouraged by the problems in the world, by the suffering we see around us, by the challenges we face in our own lives. We can become disappointed by church, by the weaknesses of other Christians, by our own faults, our own shortcomings. The symptoms are often the same. We may find ourselves going through the motions of our faith, attending church, reading the Bible out of habit, rather than a desire to know God more. We may find ourselves feeling from God. His presence being distant from us, unsure of His presence even being around us. We may find ourselves struggling with doubt, questioning the truth that we once treasured. Recognizing these things can be difficult. It requires a level of self-awareness. It requires a level of honesty that we're not always comfortable with. But it's only by acknowledging, when we recognize that our spiritual is drying up. Our spiritual dryness is getting worse. It's getting bigger and bigger. That we can begin to address the problems. In the story of Elijah, he ran for his life. He was driven by fear until he was exhausted. He ran till he collapsed under a broom tree. He wanted to give up. He wanted to quit fighting. You may feel like giving up your fight. Stress, pressures can rob our willpower. You may be the only Christian in your family or on your job. Your efforts to win others or change your environment that you're in may seem in vain. Our prayers may seem to go unanswered for a long time, causing you to lose your faith and feel like giving up the fight. So what did Elijah do when he felt like this? What did God do for him? You know, when I was in school, I played football. Never did play basketball. I really didn't like it. There wasn't enough physical contact for me, I don't guess. But I just didn't care for it. Too much running or something, I don't know. But in basketball, what is the most important skill for players to have? One of the most important skills for them to have is the ability to rebound, isn't it? Rebounds occur because a shot somewhere has missed. There's no need to rebound unless a shot was attempted, but somehow something went wrong in that attempt that caused that shot to miss where it was going, and therefore you have a need for a rebound, right? The same thing that causes missed shots in a basketball game also can cause missed shots in our life. One reason a shot can be missed is that the player was often, they'd lost their perspective. They lost their viewpoint. They were looking at the goal, but they saw what they didn't match. They may have shot too short, too long, too hard, too soft, but somewhere their perspective of the goal was off. Another reason the shots are missed in a basketball game is because the opposing team is in the player's face. It's the job of the opposing team to wave their hands in the shooter's face, isn't it? To obstruct their view, to provide a distraction. Now, does any of that sound like life? We lose our perspective sometimes. Sometimes we have an opposition waving their hands in our face, causing us to lose our view, causing us to be distracted. Any coach will want their player to go for the rebound, to go for it when they've missed the shot. The players shouldn't walk off the court. They shouldn't quit the game. They shouldn't throw in the towel because they have missed the shot. A good player will go back. They will go back up for the ball and retrieve it and try again, won't they? In the Bible, there's a lot of people who missed shots. Many of God's best servants missed their target and had to deal with the consequences of losing that shot. In fact, the Bible tells us that many people whom God used were on the rebound, and Elijah was one of them. So how did God help him get his fight back? How did he help him get his fight back? God made him rest. God put him to sleep. You know, sleep deprivation, let me put it that way, does affect decision making. Sleepy subjects choose to quit the task prematurely or take unreasonable risk. 60 to 80% of patients with depression have reported sleep deprivation. Deprivation. There you go. Okay? I'm looking around at all of you before I tell this next story. A preacher was preaching one Sunday morning, and he was aggravated because a man right on the front row had his head cocked back and was sound asleep and snoring. He tried preaching louder, but the louder he preached, the sounder the man slept. Finally, the preacher asked the person next to the sleeping man, he said, "Sir, would you mind waking him up?" The man replied, "No, I won't. You put him to sleep, you wake him up." Quote by George Burns. You know the secret of a good sermon is to have a good beginning and a good end, and to have the two of them as close together as possible. I'm almost there, okay? In the story of Elijah, we see an example of a man who was at the end of his rope. He was exhausted. He was depressed. He was ready to give up. But instead of hiding his feelings, he cried out to God in his desperation. He was honest about his situation. And because of that, God was able to meet him in his place of need and rejuvenate his zeal. Thursday, I shared with y'all Job 7, verse 11 that morning. And it says, I cannot keep from speaking. I must express my anguish. My bitter soul must complain. In my Bible reading, I'm in the book of Job. And Job does a lot of complaining. He tells God the way what he feels. Can we do the same? We should. We too can cry out to God in our times of spiritual dryness. We can be honest with him about our doubts, our fears, our frustrations. We can ask him to rejuvenate our zeal, to reignite our passion for him. And we can trust that he will meet us in our place of need, just as he did Elijah. This isn't a sign of failure. It's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of growth. It's an opportunity to depend on our relationship with God, to learn to rely on him wholly. W-H-O-L-L-Y, wholly. To experience his grace in an all-new way. Rejuvenating our zeal for the Lord is not a one-time event. It doesn't just happen once and you're done. But a continuous process that we must engage in throughout our Christian journey. And I'll finish with this. I told you I was almost done. A young man had lost his job, and he didn't know which way to turn. So he went to see the old preacher. Pacing about in the preacher's study, the young man ranted about his problems. Finally, he clenched his fist and shouted, I've begged God to say something to help me. Tell me, preacher, why doesn't God answer? The old preacher who sat across from the room from him spoke something to him and replied. Something so hushed that it was hard to understand. The young man stepped across the room and he said, what did you say? The preacher repeated himself. But again, the tone was so soft, almost as a whisper. So the young man moved closer until he was leaning on the preacher's chair. Sorry, he said, I still didn't hear you. With their heads bent together, the old preacher spoke once more. And he said, God sometimes whispers, so we will move closer to hear him. This time the young man heard him, and he understood what he was talking about. We all want God's voice to thunder, don't we? We want it to thunder through the air to answer our problems. God is still a small voice, that gentle whisper. Remember when Elijah standing in the mouth of the cave, God came by, God passed by, and the winds blew so hard and it shook the mountain that chunks of granite fell off the side of the mountain. God wasn't there. He wasn't in that wind. And the earth shook so bad that more rocks still fell off the side of the mountain, but God wasn't in the earthquake. And then this roaring fire appeared, and God wasn't in the fire. Then Elijah heard him. God was that whisper. God was the whisper. Perhaps the reason that nothing draws human focus quite like a whisper. God's whisper means we must stop our ranting and move closer to him until our heads are bent together with his. Then we can listen and we'll find the answer. Psalms 46 verse 10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." We need to hear the still small voice of God. He's speaking to us today. To some, he's speaking of salvation. Where Jesus says, "Look, I stand at the door and knock, and if you hear my voice." To others, he's speaking to you about your circumstances. Still some, he's speaking to you about your busyness. And in in Mark 6, verse 31, she don't have this one down there, but it says, "Let's go off." This is Jesus talking. He says, "Let's go off by ourselves to a quiet place and rest a while." So do you need rejuvenated? Do you need your zeal refreshed? Maybe we need to find that place, that quiet place of rest with God. And spend some time with him and rest with him. Because that is all the hustle and bustle and excitement that we have going on around. Sometimes we have to stop and rest. And I know that's the pot calling the kettle black. Betty's looking at me and smiling, but I'm supposed to practice what I preach, right? Well, I'm going to do that tomorrow, okay?